The first thing Aderyn Voss noticed about the Seoul Group's headquarters was that it was built to erase you. 78 floors of black glass and raw steel punching through the Seoul skyline like a declaration of war, not against enemies, but against the very concept of insignificance. From the outside, it looked like the future. From the inside, it felt like a very expensive cage. The lobby swallowed her whole. Floors of obsidian stone so immaculate they reflected the overhead lights in perfect, unsettling symmetry, as if the building itself was watching you from below. Men in tailored charcoal suits stood at precise intervals, not receptionists, not security. Sentinels. Their eyes moved the way surveillance cameras did, slow, deliberate, missing nothing. The art installations suspended from the ceilings weren't decorative. They were a message. We have so much power, we spend it on things that mean nothing. The whole building ran on two fuels, money and fear, mostly fear. And as Aderyn stepped through the automated glass doors on her first morning, laptop bag on one shoulder, custom-built deck tucked under her arm like a weapon, because that was exactly what it was, she made herself a single, quiet promise. You built this place to make people feel small. Let's see how it handles someone who doesn't. She was right not to be afraid. She just didn't know yet that the building wasn't the threat. The man on the 78th floor was, and he had been breaking people far more prepared than her for the better part of 2 decades. Aderyn was 28 years old, cybersecurity architect, MIT graduate, the woman who had personally dismantled the digital infrastructure of 2 Fortune 500 companies at their request, rebuilt both from the ground up, and walked away with her NDA, her equity, and her reputation perfectly intact. In her field, her name moved before she did. 3 continents, 7-figure consulting offers, a waitlist so long she had stopped checking it. She had flown 14 hours from San Francisco for this. Unlimited budget, 0 interference, full access. She had not flown 14 hours to be intimidated by a lobby. 6 weeks earlier, Aderyn had been in the middle of dismantling a ghost network embedded inside a pharmaceutical giant's mainframe when the offer arrived. Not an email, not a LinkedIn message, not even a phone call from an overeager recruiter with a scripted pitch and a commission to chase. A letter, handwritten, on paper so thick and cream-white it felt like holding money. She almost threw it away. Physical mail in her industry was either a lawsuit or a publicity stunt, and she had the lawyers for one and 0 patience for the other. But something about the weight of it, the deliberate, almost arrogant confidence of sending paper to a woman who lived inside servers made her pause. She set down her coffee, flipped it open, and read it standing at her kitchen counter in her San Francisco apartment, still in the oversized Howard University hoodie she'd slept in. It was 4 sentences long. Ms. Voss, your work on the Meridian collapse is the most elegant systems intervention we have encountered in 11 years of looking. We have a project in Seoul that requires exactly your kind of mind. Name your number. No company letterhead, no signature, just a private relay address at the bottom and a single embossed symbol pressed into the corner of the page. A stylized dragon coiled around a circuit board, so small she almost missed it. She photographed it, ran it through 3 separate image databases, and came up with nothing. Which, in her world, meant one of 2 things. Either whoever sent this was nobody, or they were so far above the waterline that the databases hadn't been built yet to hold them. She replied in 48 hours, not because she was interested, because she was offended by the anonymity, and the fastest way to get answers was to pull the thread. The reply came in 6 minutes. By the end of the week, she was on a video call with a soft-spoken man named Lucian Drieger, European accent she couldn't quite place, eyes that moved like he was always reading 2 conversations at once, who introduced himself as the group's chief strategy officer and outlined the project with the kind of calm precision that told her he had done this pitch many, many times before. The Seoul Group, he explained, was one of Korea's oldest and most quietly powerful conglomerates. Logistics, real estate, private equity, legacy infrastructure that had over decades become exactly that legacy, outdated, analog, vulnerable. They were looking to undergo a total digital transformation. Internal systems, financial architecture, communications networks, security protocols. Everything rebuilt from the floor up. "We want it done properly," Lucian said, and the way he said properly made it clear that every person they had spoken to before her had failed that standard. No patchwork, no compromise, full integration. "Timeline?" Aderyn asked. 6 months for Phase 1. "Budget?" He named a figure that made her set her pen down. She picked it back up. "Scope of access." "Total," he didn't blink. "Every system, every floor, every file." Aderyn leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing what her graduate advisor used to call her processing face. The expression she wore when a problem was interesting enough to actually deserve her full attention. "I work alone," she said finally. "I don't take direction from internal IT. I don't share my architecture until it's complete. And I have a clause in every contract. If I find something inside your system that crosses a legal or ethical line, I reserve the right to walk." Lucian smiled for the first time. Small, controlled, like a man who had already accounted for everything she was about to say. "Of course." She should have noticed that he agreed too quickly. She didn't, or rather she noticed, filed it, and overwrote it, because the problem was extraordinary and her curiosity had always been her most dangerous quality. 2 weeks later, Aderyn Voss landed at Incheon International Airport with 2 carry-ons, one custom-built deck that had been flagged and cleared by security in 3 countries, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had never encountered a system she couldn't crack. Seoul received her the way powerful cities always did, indifferently, loudly, and at full speed. She stood at the arrival's exit, neon signage bleeding color across the wet pavement, the city humming its particular late-night frequency of traffic and ambition. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific electricity of a problem that was actually worthy of her. A black car was waiting. No driver introduction. Just a door held open and a silence that expected her to fill it with compliance. She got in. She pulled up the relay address on her phone and typed a single message. "I'm here. Clock starts tomorrow." The response came before the car had cleared the airport exit. "He's looking forward to meeting you." Aderyn frowned at the screen. Every prior communication had referred to the client as the group. Institutional, corporate, plural. "Hey." She looked out the window at Seoul sliding past in streaks of light and glass. And for the first time, just once, just briefly, something at the base of her spine moved in a direction that wasn't excitement. She ignored it. She was good at that. She met him on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Men like Kwon Seok-ryu, and she would come to understand that there were no other men quite like Kwon Seok-ryu, should have been encountered on a Friday night, in the dark, with the kind of atmospheric warning that gave you time to adjust your posture and your expectations. Not on a Tuesday morning, under fluorescent-adjacent lighting, with a cup of green tea she hadn't asked for cooling on the glass table in front of her. But that was the first thing she learned about him. He didn't give you time to prepare. That was the point. The 70th floor was nothing like the lobby. Where the lobby performed wealth loudly, all marble and mirrors and deliberate intimidation, the executive level was almost quiet in its power. The elevator opened directly into a corridor lined with dark Paulownia wood paneling, the kind of material that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. No receptionists up here. No art installations. No excess of any kind. Just clean, severe lines and the particular stillness of a space that belonged entirely to one person and knew it. Aderyn walked the corridor alone. She had been told someone would escort her. No one came. She understood, 3 steps in, that this was intentional, that the walk itself was part of the assessment, that somewhere in the walls or ceiling, lenses were tracking every detail of how she moved through a space that was designed to feel like his. She slowed down deliberately, looked at the wood paneling, ran her fingertips along the edge of it, just lightly, as if she were simply curious. She was, but she also wanted whatever was watching to note that she was not in a hurry, that she found the architecture interesting rather than oppressive. That she was not performing composure. She simply had it. At the end of the corridor was a single door, not the heavy oak she had imagined from the outside. Something older, darker. A wood she couldn't immediately name, iron-handled, set into the wall with the kind of permanence that said it had been here long before the skyscraper was built around it. She knocked once. Enter. 2 syllables. Korean-accented English, low and even, with the precise diction of a man who had learned the language as a tool rather than a courtesy. She entered. The office was a contradiction she hadn't anticipated. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, Seoul sprawling below them in every direction like a circuit board from this altitude, all grids and light and the organized chaos of a city that never fully slept. But against the 4th wall, where she would have expected a power display, awards, photographs, the usual theater of a man who needed you to know who he was, there was a single mounted scroll. Traditional ink painting. A mountain in rain. So understated it was almost aggressive. He was standing at the window when she entered. Not sitting behind the desk, standing, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city the way someone watches something they own. He was taller than she expected. Lean in the way of men who move purposefully and eat as an afterthought. Dark suit, no tie, a single ring on his right hand that caught the light once and then didn't again. He turned when she reached the center of the room. Not immediately, a beat after, as if completing a thought. And then he looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she would later describe to Eunara as surgical. The gaze of a man who was not seeing her as a person so much as a variable, cataloging her weight and worth in the same unconscious breath. Aderyn held it without flinching. She was used to being assessed. She had walked into rooms full of men who needed her to be smaller than she was and had never once obliged them. She was not about to start on the 78th floor of a Seoul skyscraper. Ms. Voss, he didn't move toward her, didn't extend a hand. Mr. Kwon, she didn't move toward him either. A silence passed between them that lasted roughly 4 seconds and contained an entire negotiation. He gestured toward the table. She sat. He remained standing for a moment longer, not power playing it, exactly, just finishing whatever internal calculation he was running, and then sat across from her with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his adult life been told to wait. You reviewed the project scope, he said, not a question. Thoroughly. And you have questions. Several. She opened her deck, pulled up her preliminary system audit framework, and turned the screen to face him. Your current digital infrastructure is running on 4 separate legacy architectures that are not communicating with each other effectively. Your financial network has 17 access points that any moderately skilled operator could breach in under 3 hours. Your internal communications are being routed through a server cluster in Busan that hasn't been updated since 2019. She paused. Which is either a significant oversight or a deliberate choice, and I need to know which before I begin. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise. She got the impression that very little surprised Kwon Seok-ryu. It was closer to recalibration. The micro-adjustment of a man who had expected a consultant and received something else entirely. A deliberate choice, he said. The Busan cluster handles communications we prefer to keep off the primary network. I'll need access to it. In time. Mr. Kwon, she kept her voice level, pleasant, even. I was told total access, full scope. If there are systems I'm excluded from, I can't guarantee the integrity of what I build around them. A chain is only as clean as its dirtiest link. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Seoul moved 68 floors below them, indifferent and enormous. Somewhere in the building, she could feel rather than hear the low mechanical pulse of servers. The heartbeat of whatever it was this place was actually running. You'll have what you need, he said finally, when you need it. It was not the answer she asked for. She cataloged that too. The office they assigned her was on the 44th floor. Large, glass-walled, overlooking an internal atrium that dropped 12 stories to a lobby she never saw anyone use. A workstation had been prepared, high-spec hardware, multiple displays, a fiber connection that was genuinely impressive. She didn't touch any of it. She unpacked her own equipment instead, methodically, while the man who had shown her up, young, watchful, not introduced by name, stood near the door and pretended not to observe. "You can go," she said without looking up. He left. She plugged in her deck, ran her standard sweep of the room for surveillance equipment, found 4 cameras, 2 audio pickups, and one device she didn't immediately recognize that she photographed and would spend the following evening identifying, and then sat down in the chair and looked at the wall of screens in front of her. She had asked for total access. She had been given a glass office, a monitored workstation, a cup of green tea no one had offered to refill, and a boss who answered questions with different questions. Aderyn pulled up her personal encrypted drive and opened a blank document. At the top, she typed 2 words. Dirty data. Because something in the way Kwon Seokrayo had said deliberate choice was still moving around in the back of her mind, like a flag thrown in code. A marker dropped in a system that didn't want you to look too closely at what was underneath it. She had rebuilt enough broken architectures to recognize the feeling. This wasn't a company in need of an upgrade. This was a system with something buried in it. And whoever had buried it had made the mistake of hearing the one person in the world most constitutionally incapable of leaving buried things alone. She opened her first diagnostic window and began to pull thread. She found the First Anomaly on a Wednesday, at 2:47 in the morning. Not because she had been looking for it specifically. She had been running a routine mapping sequence across the group's financial architecture, the kind of deep structure audit that most consultants delegated to automated tools and reviewed over breakfast. Aderyn didn't delegate. Automated tools found what they were programmed to find. She found everything else. The anomaly was small, deliberately small. The kind of irregularity that would have read as a rounding error to anyone not looking at the pattern beneath the pattern. A 0.003% variance in a recurring transfer sequence that repeated every 11 days across 6 different subsidiary accounts, each one registered in a different country, each one legitimate on its surface, each one connected to the others by a threading structure, so elegant it was almost beautiful. Almost. Aderyn sat back in her chair and stared at it. Then she pulled up the transfer destinations and started cross-referencing. By 4 a.m., she had a map. By 5 a.m., she had a name for what the map described. She closed every window, encrypted the file under a key that lived only in her personal drive, and sat in the dark of her glass-walled office for a long time, watching the Seoul dawn begin to press pale light against the skyline. Legacy system, she thought, sure. She had worked for difficult clients before, clients who kept things in rooms they didn't want opened. Every major institution had its shadow architecture, the informal networks, the handshake agreements, the transactions that lived just below the waterline of official documentation. She understood that. She was not naive about what money looked like when it moved at scale and didn't want to be seen moving. But this was different. What she had found embedded in the Seokrayo Group's financial architecture wasn't a shadow. It was a skeleton, the encoded record of 11 years of money that had moved through this system like blood through a body that couldn't acknowledge it was bleeding. Shell companies cycling funds through legitimate logistics invoices. Supplier payments routed through subsidiary chains that dissolved and reconstituted under new registrations every 18 months with mechanical precision. A layering structure so sophisticated that the money that came out the other end was genuinely, documentably clean. Except for the blood block. That was what she called it. In her private file, because it was the only name that fit. A compressed data node buried 4 layers deep in the earliest version of the financial architecture, predigitization, manually encoded at some point in the system's history by someone who knew exactly what they were hiding and wanted it hidden somewhere only they could find it again. It was a ledger. Not a financial ledger, not accounts and transfers and routing numbers, a different kind of record entirely. Names, dates, outcomes, written in a shorthand she had to spend 2 hours decoding because it wasn't a standard encryption protocol, it was personal, idiosyncratic, the private language of a man who had been keeping score for a very long time. She decoded enough to understand what it was. She stopped decoding before she understood too much. There was a line in her work between knowing something and being required to act on knowing it. She had spent her career walking that line with surgical precision. Information was neutral. What you did with information was the moral question. And right now, at 5:30 in the morning in a glass office on the 44th floor of a building she was increasingly certain was not a corporation, she needed to be very careful about what she decided to do with what she knew. She opened a new encrypted file. She titled it Kill Switch. And she began to build. The thing people misunderstood about Aderyn Voss, the thing that her clients consistently failed to account for, the thing that Kwon Seok-ryu would spend the next several weeks catastrophically underestimating, was that her ethics were not a weakness. They were an architecture. She had built them the same way she built everything, deliberately, structurally, with load-bearing principles at the foundation and flexibility engineered into every upper layer. She could operate in gray spaces. She could hold contradictory information without collapsing under it. She could work for imperfect institutions without becoming complicit in their imperfection, as long as she maintained what she called her kill switch clause, the personal right, built into every contract she had ever signed, to pull her work entirely if the line between gray and black was crossed. The blood block was not gray. But she was not ready to pull the kill switch. Not yet. Because pulling it meant walking out of this building with nothing but the encrypted files on her personal drive, and whatever was in those files was the kind of information that made people into liabilities. She had seen enough of this architecture to know that the Seoul group did not have a graceful offboarding process for liabilities. She needed leverage before she needed an exit. So she kept working. She showed up to the 44th floor every morning at 8. She ran her visible diagnostics, filed her progress reports through the official channel Lucian Drieger had established, answered his check-in calls with the precise measure of progress that kept him satisfied without revealing anything she had actually found. She was professional. She was thorough. She was, on the surface, exactly the consultant they had hired. Underneath the surface, she was building something else entirely. It was during the 3rd week that she found the second layer. She had been working through the Buson's server cluster. She had been granted access, eventually, with the particular reluctant precision of someone handing over a key they hadn't wanted to hand over. And what she found there reoriented everything she thought she understood about the scope of what she was dealing with. The Buson cluster wasn't a communications backup. It was a nerve center. Routing encrypted data traffic for 17 separate entities that had no official relationship with the Seoul group, no shared registration, no documented partnership, no financial thread she could follow through the legitimate architecture. And yet the traffic patterns were unmistakable. The handshake protocols, the timing sequences, the response latency. It all pointed to a single controlling intelligence sitting at the center of a network that was vast and quiet and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know what the shape of invisible looked like. Aderyn mapped it slowly, over the course of 4 days, running her queries in the small windows between official tasks so they wouldn't register as anomalous on the monitoring software she had identified on day 1 and been routing around ever since. When the map was complete, she looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the blood block file, then back at the map. Then she understood. The money laundering architecture wasn't incidental to the Seoul group's operations. It wasn't a side channel, a parallel business, a legacy indiscretion from the organization's earlier years. It was the skeleton that the legitimate corporation was built on top of, the load-bearing structure underneath the glass and steel and charcoal suits and ink paintings of mountains in rain. The Seoul group was not a corporation with a crime problem. It was a criminal organization with a very good corporation built over it. And she was currently sitting inside it, 44 floors up, with total access to its central nervous system, having just spent 3 weeks making herself indispensable to the man who ran it. Aderyn closed her screens methodically, one by one. She picked up her personal phone, not the one the group had issued her on day 2, which she had been leaving in her apartment every morning since day 3, and typed a single message to a number she had memorized and never stored. "I need a secure line, tonight." Then she sat in the hum of the servers and thought about the kill switch file growing quietly on her encrypted drive, and about the blood block sitting 4 layers deep in a dead man's architecture, and about Kwon Seok-ryu standing at his window on the 78th floor watching Seoul like he owned it. He thought she was building him an upgrade. He was right. He just didn't know yet that the upgrade came with a back door. And the back door was hers. She noticed him on a Thursday, which meant he had probably been there since Monday, and the fact that it took her 3 days to consciously register his presence told her 2 things simultaneously: that he was exceptionally good at what he did, and that she had been too deep inside the code to look up often enough. She filed both observations and did not look at him again for the rest of the day. His name she learned through Eunara, who she had not yet spoken to directly but had been quietly watching for 2 weeks. The way you watch a door that might be an exit was Riven Kale. No further introduction was offered. No title. No department. In the group's official organizational chart, which she had obtained and memorized in her first week, he did not appear at all. Which told her everything the organizational chart was trying not to say. He was not security. Security had a structure, rotations, posts, radio frequencies she had mapped in her first 72 hours. He operated outside that structure entirely, which meant he answered to exactly one person, and that person was not Lucian Drieger. He was tall in the way that read as functional rather than decorative, built with the particular economy of someone who had never once trained for aesthetics. Dark, quiet, with a stillness about him that was not calm. It was the specific stillness of a system running at full capacity behind a closed interface. No wasted output, everything internal. He dressed like the rest of the Inner Circle staff, dark suits, no excess, but wore it differently. Where the others wore their suits like uniforms, Riven wore his like camouflage, something underneath it that the fabric was working to contain. He never spoke to her. For the first 4 days, he simply existed in her peripheral vision. In the corridor when she arrived, in the atrium when she crossed it, in the reflection of her office glass when she worked late, a dark shape on the far side of the building that was always facing her direction. On the 5th day, she decided she was done being observed without reciprocating. She left the office at 9 p.m. instead of her usual 11, took the elevator to the 31st floor instead of the lobby, walked the length of the east corridor, took the stairwell down 4 flights, crossed through the server access hall, nodding at the overnight technician who had stopped questioning her irregular hours by week 2, and came up through the west elevator bank. He was waiting at the lobby exit, not pretending to be doing something else, not performing casualness, just standing near the door with the particular patience of someone who had already calculated every route she might take and was content to wait at the end of all of them. Aderyn stopped 3 feet away from him and looked at him directly for the first time. He looked back, dark eyes, completely unreadable, with the quality of someone who had long ago stopped needing other people to find him approachable. "Riven Kale," she said. Something moved in his expression, microscopic, gone before she could classify it. "Ms. Voss." His voice was low and unhurried, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place, not Korean, not European. Something in between that suggested a life lived in too many places to be claimed by any of them. "Are you following me or protecting me?" she asked. "I want to know which framing to use." A pause. Both answers are true. She adjusted the strap of her bag. And who decides when one becomes the other? He looked at her steadily. "That depends on you." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then walked past him through the door, out into the Seoul night, where the air tasted like rain that hadn't fallen yet, and the city moved around her in its enormous, indifferent rhythm. She did not look back, but she noted, without needing to check, that she could hear exactly one set of footsteps behind her own. the rules of their arrangement, because it became an arrangement, unspoken and structurally precise the way all the most dangerous things were, established themselves over the following week. He followed her. She allowed it. She did not pretend he wasn't there, and he did not pretend to be anything other than what he was. Within those parameters, a kind of strange, armed courtesy developed between them, the mutual acknowledgement of two people who recognized in each other a level of competence that made pretense not just unnecessary, but vaguely insulting. She learned his patterns. He was good, genuinely, technically excellent, but patterns were patterns, and Aderyn had spent her career finding the signal inside the noise. He checked exits before she moved. He positioned himself between her and unfamiliar variables. When her phone lit up, his posture shifted barely, but measurably in the direction of whoever might be on the other end. He was not just watching her. He was watching everything around her. Which raised a question she hadn't expected to be asking. Was Riven Kale there to keep her in, or to keep something else out? She stored the question in the back of her mind, where she kept things that didn't have answers yet. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, 11 days into his surveillance, in the elevator on the way down from 44. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and a cold brew that had stopped being effective somewhere around hour 6 of a deep diagnostic sequence. She was not, she would later acknowledge, operating at full emotional regulation, which was the only explanation for what she said when the elevator doors closed, and it was just the two of them in the muted light of the descending car. "You were military," she said, not a question. He didn't answer immediately. The elevator moved. "Before this," she clarified, "the way you clear a room before you enter it, the way you stand with your back to the wall in the atrium, the way you," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "process people." Another silence, 3 floors. "Among other things," he said finally. "And now you work for him." "Now I work for him. Does that bother you?" The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He looked at her sideways, just for a moment, in the way of someone deciding something, and then stepped out first, clearing the space on reflex before she followed. "Does building his infrastructure bother you?" he asked without turning around. She almost smiled. "Touché." She filed the exchange in the kill switch folder she kept in her mind alongside the one on her drive, because a man who answered a question with an honest counter-question was a more complicated variable than she had initially budgeted for. She didn't like complicated variables. She liked them less when they were assigned to watch her sleep. 3 days later, she came back to her apartment to find it exactly as she had left it. Which was the problem? She had left it with 3 tells, a hair across the left cabinet hinge, a specific angle on her secondary laptop, a glass set 2 centimeters from the coaster in a way that looked accidental and was not. A habit so old and automatic she barely registered doing it anymore. All 3 tells were in place. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. Whoever had been in her apartment was good enough to find her tells and reset them. She stood in the middle of her kitchen for a long time, very still, running the implications. Then she went to the corner of the bathroom where she had installed her own surveillance node on day 4, a device the size of a thumbnail, drawing power from the USB port behind the mirror cabinet, storing locally to a chip she checked manually, and pulled the footage. 1 visitor, 40 minutes, professional, efficient, touched almost nothing, photographed her secondary laptop without opening it, checked the bathroom cabinet, the kitchen drawers, the inner pocket of her spare jacket. Looking for something specific. Looking, she was almost certain, for evidence of what she had found. Which meant someone in that building, not Riven. She had already ruled out his behavioral signature. This was someone smaller, faster, operating on different instincts. Already knew or suspected that she had gone looking beyond her official brief. Aderyn sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the ceiling. She had been in Seoul for 5 weeks. She had found a criminal architecture of extraordinary sophistication, a blood block that could dismantle an empire, a surveillance detail she hadn't fully decoded, and now a search of her private space executed with enough skill to tell her that the level of intelligence operating around her was significantly higher than she had initially mapped. She opened her encrypted drive. She looked at the kill switch file. Not yet. She opened the file beneath it instead. The one she had titled, On a Quiet Night 3 weeks ago, with the name of the only person in this building whose eyes moved like someone who was also keeping secrets. Eunara Vey. It was time to stop watching the door and try the handle. Lucian Drieger invited her to lunch on a Friday. Which was how she knew it was a trap. Not because Friday was suspicious, or because lunch was suspicious, or even because Lucian himself was, on the surface, anything other than what he presented. Composed, intellectually precise, the kind of man who made you feel like the smartest person in the room right up until the moment you realized he had engineered that feeling deliberately and for a reason. It was suspicious because in 5 weeks, Lucian Drieger had never once suggested anything as informal as lunch. Their interactions had been structured with the mechanical regularity of a scheduled process. Check-in calls at 10 a.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, progress reports filed through the official channel by end of business Friday, the occasional corridor exchange that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and not 1 second more. He operated on a rhythm. She had mapped it in week 1. Lunch was off rhythm. Off rhythm meant intention. She accepted immediately. The restaurant was on the 52nd floor of a separate building 3 blocks from the Seoul Tower. A private dining room that required a reservation she was fairly certain had been held permanently. The kind of establishment that had no menu because the menu was whatever you were served, and the point was not the food. Floor-to-ceiling windows again. Seoul again, spreading itself out below them like an argument for human ambition. She was beginning to understand that every significant conversation in this world happened at altitude, as if the height itself was meant to remind you how far there was to fall. Lucian was already seated when she arrived, which she had also expected. Men who controlled situations always arrived first, to own the room before you entered it. He stood when she came in because his manners were impeccable, which she had never once mistaken for warmth. Aderyn, first name, new development. Lucian. She matched it without hesitation, set her bag down, and sat across from him with the easy composure of a woman attending a meeting she had fully prepared for, which she had. The food arrived without being ordered. Of course it did. He opened with small talk, which she endured with professional patience. The kind of small talk that wasn't small at all, but was instead a series of precisely calibrated observations designed to establish a particular atmosphere. He was cultured, well-traveled, conversationally elegant. He referenced a paper she had published 4 years ago with the casual familiarity of someone who had read it recently and carefully. He asked about her experience of Seoul with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. She answered everything lightly, pleasantly, and said nothing she hadn't already decided to say. By the second course, he moved. "You've been running queries on the Busan cluster," he said. Same tone as everything else, utterly conversational, the pivot so smooth it was almost invisible. Almost. "I have," she said. "It's part of the infrastructure I was brought in to assess." "Of course." He lifted his glass. "We've noticed some of the query sequences extend beyond the operational parameters of the digitization brief." "We've noticed." She cataloged the pronoun. "Systems don't exist in isolation, Lucian. If I'm rebuilding the architecture, I need to understand everything the current system is touching, including the parts that weren't in the original brief. That's not a deviation. That's due diligence." "Naturally," he nodded with the measured approval of a man who had expected that answer. "We have no concerns about due diligence. The group values thoroughness." A pause, timed with surgical precision. "We simply want to ensure that the scope of the project remains productive for everyone." Aderyn set down her fork. She looked at him. She let the silence sit for a beat longer than was comfortable, the way you let a line of code execute before reading the output, and then she said, "Are you asking me to stop looking at the Busan cluster, or are you telling me to?" Something shifted in his face. Microscopic. The recalibration of a man who had written a script for this conversation and had just encountered a line that wasn't in it. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that certain elements of the group's infrastructure are sensitive in ways that fall outside the technical scope of your engagement, and that a consultant of your caliber understands the value of discretion." "I do understand the value of discretion," she said pleasantly. "I also understand the value of complete information, and I understand very well the liability profile of a consultant who builds a new architecture on top of a compromised foundation without documenting the compromise." She picked up her fork again. "If something is in those systems that you'd rather I not see, Lucian, the correct move is to tell me what it is so I can architect around it. Not to have this conversation, and hope I take the hint." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, not the small, controlled smile from their first call, something older, something that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "You're very direct," he said. "It saves time. It can also," he said softly, "create friction, in environments where friction is costly." There it was. Not a threat. Lucian Drieger would never be so architecturally unsophisticated as to issue a direct threat over a private lunch, but the shape of one. The outline, rendered in perfect deniability. Aderyn ate a piece of fish that was genuinely excellent and thought about the data she had pulled from the Busan cluster at 3 a.m. 2 nights ago. The data she had already encrypted, partitioned, and distributed across 4 separate locations, only one of which was on any device that had ever been inside the Seoul building. She thought about the kill switch file. She thought about Lucian Drieger's own data. Specifically, the query logs she had pulled from the monitoring software she had been routing around since day one, which told her not just that she was being watched, but how she was being watched, which told her who had designed the surveillance architecture, which had led her, through a sequence of inferences she had run and rerun until they were airtight, directly to the man sitting across from her. Lucian hadn't just been reporting on her progress to Seoul. He had been running a parallel intelligence operation, monitoring her queries, mapping her movements through the system, building a profile of exactly how much she had found and when she had found it, feeding that profile upward, advising, she suspected, on when to apply pressure and how. He was not the strategist behind the scenes. He was the mechanism, the beautiful, precise, self-regarding mechanism of a man who had confused being a very good tool with being powerful. And he had just shown her exactly which data points he was operating from, which meant she now knew precisely what he didn't know she knew, which was everything. "I appreciate the lunch," she said, when the last course was cleared and the particular tension of the meal had settled into something approaching resolution. "And I take your point about discretion." She smiled at him with all the warmth of a woman who meant none of it. "I'll keep it in mind." He walked her to the elevator, pressed the call button, stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, every line of him a portrait of patrician ease. "The group values your work enormously," he said. "Mr. Kwon speaks highly of your capability." "I'm glad to hear it." The elevator arrived. She stepped in, turned to face him. "Lucian," she held the door. "The monitoring architecture on the 44th floor, the secondary layer, not the official security feed. It was well designed." She paused. "You might want to update the timestamp protocol on the log files. Right now they're writing in UTC. Your primary server is in KSD. The 2-hour differential makes the query sequence visible to anyone who knows to look for it." She smiled again. Just a thought. She let the door close on his expression, the first genuinely unguarded thing she had seen on his face in 5 weeks, and rode down alone, watching the floors descend, already running the next sequence in her mind. She had told him the truth. The timestamp vulnerability was real. She had found it in week 2. What she hadn't told him was that she had already used it, had already extracted the full log of his surveillance operation against her, every query, every flag, every report filed upward, and had it stored in the same encrypted partition as the blood block. She hadn't found the vulnerability and fixed it. She had found it, left it open, and used it as a door. Lucian Drieger had spent 5 weeks watching her. She had spent 5 weeks watching him watch her. And now she knew everything he knew, everything he'd reported, and, most critically, everything he still didn't understand about what she had built while he was looking. The elevator reached the lobby. She walked out into the Seoul afternoon, pulled out her personal phone, and typed a message to the number she had memorized. "I need the meeting moved up. I found the second player." Then she typed a second message to a different number, one she had obtained 3 days ago through a sequence of social engineering, so elegant she was privately a little proud of it. "T," she sent, "I know a place that won't be on anyone's radar." She waited. 40 seconds later, her phone vibrated. "Tomorrow, 7 p.m., I'll find you." Aderyn slid her phone into her pocket and walked into the current of the Seoul afternoon, already building the next move. Lucian Drieger had tried to play chess with her. The problem, the fundamental, catastrophic problem, was that she hadn't been playing chess. She had been playing the board. The place Eunara chose was not on anyone's radar. A basement tea house in Insadong, down a staircase so narrow you had to descend it sideways, behind a door that was painted the same color as the wall it was set into, and had no signage of any kind. The kind of establishment that existed entirely through word of mouth, passed between people who trusted each other absolutely, which meant it had survived 40 years in one of Seoul's most surveilled neighborhoods without once appearing in a search result, a review platform, or a photograph. Aderyn found it in 11 minutes using nothing but the cross-referenced foot traffic patterns in the neighborhood's public CCTV data and the specific block radius Eunara's message had implied. She arrived 8 minutes early and sat with her back to the wall facing the door, ordered a celadon-glazed cup of Omija tea she didn't touch, and waited. She had been watching Eunara Vey for 3 weeks. Not because Eunara had done anything to attract her attention, quite the opposite. Eunara was exceptionally good at existing in a room without becoming a focal point of it, which in the architecture of the Seoul group's inner circle was either a survival mechanism or a professional skill, and Aderyn had not yet determined which. She moved through the building with a quality of self-containment that read, to the casual observer, as simple professionalism. Polished, quiet, precisely calibrated to the expectations of the environment she occupied. But Aderyn was not a casual observer. And what she noticed, underneath the calibration, was something else. The micropauses before Eunara answered certain questions in meetings, not hesitation, exactly, but the beat of someone translating from their real answer to the answer they intended to give. The way her eyes moved when Lucian spoke, not toward him but away, a fraction of a degree, as if maintaining eye contact with him required a small, regular expenditure of will. The fact that her workstation, unlike every other senior staff member's, ran 2 separate login sessions simultaneously. One on the group's official network, one on an external relay she had disguised as a diagnostic tool so convincingly that it had sailed through 3 IT audits. Aderyn had identified the relay in week 2. She had not reported it. Instead, she had spent a week tracing where it led, carefully, without touching it, the way you map a tripwire without stepping on it. And what she found on the other end of Eunara Vey's hidden relay had reoriented her entire understanding of the situation she was inside. Eunara was not just a corporate insider with a secret. She was already working against the Seoul group. The question Aderyn had been sitting with for 7 days before she sent the tea message, was for whom? Eunara arrived at 7:02 p.m. 2 minutes late, which Aderyn clocked not as carelessness but as deliberate, the extra 2 minutes used, she suspected, to run a final counter-surveillance check on the street above. She came down the narrow stairs with the fluid composure of a woman who had learned to enter rooms without announcing herself, unwound a fine wool scarf from her neck, and found Aderyn's table with eyes that had already swept the room twice before she sat down. She was younger than she looked in the building, mid-30s, but the corporate armor aged her, the structured blazers, the severe hair, the expression of permanent, measured neutrality. Down here, in the warm underground light of the tea house, with her coat off and her hands wrapped around a cup of barley tea the server had brought without being asked, she looked like what she actually was. A woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had gotten dangerously good at not showing it. They looked at each other across the low table. "You found my relay," Eunara said. Not a question. Her English was precise, slightly formal, with the cadence of someone who had learned it academically and then spent years sharpening it against real use. 3 weeks ago, Aderyn confirmed. "And you didn't report it?" "No." Eunara studied her. "Why?" "Because whoever you're talking to on the other end of it," Aderyn said. "I wanted to know before I decided what to do with the information. And because," she paused, choosing the precision of the next words carefully, "I had the sense that you and I were looking at the same thing from different angles." A silence. The tea house moved quietly around them, low voices at other tables, the particular acoustics of an underground room that absorbed sound and kept it. "What do you think you know?" Eunara asked. "I know about the blood block," Aderyn said. Something happened in Eunara's face. Not surprise. The surprise was already gone by the time it reached the surface, processed and contained in the fraction of a second between hearing the words and responding to them. What was left was something rawer. Recognition. The specific expression of a person who has been alone with a secret for so long that hearing someone else name it feels like being seen for the first time in years. She looked down at her tea. "How far did you go into it?" she asked quietly. "Far enough to understand what it is, not so far that I can't unsee it." Aderyn held her cup. "I stopped at the operational layer. I didn't go into the names." Eunara looked up. "But you could." "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. "I've been inside it for 2 years," Eunara said, not loudly. The way you say something you've never said out loud before, testing the weight of it in the open air. "Not by choice. I came to the group as a legitimate corporate hire financial architecture 3 years ago. I found what you found in my first month." A pause. "I didn't have your options. I couldn't walk away. By the time I understood what I was inside, I was already inside it." "So you found another way," Aderyn said. "I found someone who could use what I had." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've been feeding information out through the relay for 14 months. Transaction records, operational communications, names." Her voice didn't waver. "Enough to build a case, not enough to close it. Not yet." "What are you missing?" Eunara met her eyes. "The blood block, the original ledger. It's the only record that connects the current operations to the founding structure, the evidence that proves the organization's criminal architecture wasn't incidental, wasn't a deviation, but was designed, built in, from the beginning." She paused. "Without it, what I have is compelling. With it." "It's airtight," Aderyn finished. "Yes." Aderyn set down her cup. She looked at the table for a moment, running the architecture of what she was being asked, not in words, not yet, but in the clear structural logic of what this conversation was, and what saying yes would mean for the kill switch file, for her exit, for the specific and carefully maintained line between knowing something and being required to act on it that she had been walking for 6 weeks. She thought about the blood block. The compressed weight of 11 years of record, encoded in a dead man's private language, sitting 4 layers deep in a system she had more access to than anyone else in this building. She thought about Kwon Seok-ryu at his window, the mountain painting, the ring catching light once and then going dark. She thought about Lucian Drieger's smile. She thought about Riven Kale clearing exits on reflex, standing with his back to walls, answering questions with counter-questions in elevator light. She thought about the apartment search, the reset tells, the thumbnail surveillance node behind the mirror cabinet. She thought about the kill switch clause, built into every contract she had ever signed, in the language of a woman who had always known that one day she would find a system where the line between gray and black was not ambiguous at all. "I need to know who you're working with," she said. "Before anything else, I don't partner into a structure I can't see." Eunara nodded. She had expected this. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a small card on the table, not a business card, just a handwritten series of characters that Aderyn recognized as a secure relay identifier, the same class of protocol she used herself. "Contact them directly," Eunara said. "Verify everything I've told you independently. I'd expect nothing less." A pause. "They've been watching this case for 3 years. They know who you are. They've been hoping you'd find it." Aderyn picked up the card. "If I do this," she said, "I do it my way, full architectural control. Nobody touches the blood block except through my system. The extraction happens on my timeline through a method I design, and I retain a copy of everything not as leverage, as insurance." She looked up. "And I need a guaranteed exit, not a provisional one, a real one with teeth." Eunara didn't flinch. "Agreed." "All of it. All of it." She held Aderyn's gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been waiting a long time to say yes to something. "I've been in this building for 3 years, Aderyn. I know every room, every rotation, every blind spot and every camera on every floor." A pause. "And you know the system from the inside out." She almost smiled, the first real expression Aderyn had seen on her face all evening, something tired and sharp and quietly fierce. "Together, we're the most dangerous thing that has ever walked into this building." Aderyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her Omija tea, cold now, deep red, tasting of 5 flavors the way its name promised, and drank it. "Tell me about the exit routes," she said. And Eunara began to talk. They stayed in the basement tea house for 3 hours. By the time they climbed the narrow stairs back into the Insadong night, the street above was quieter, the neon softer, the city in that particular late-evening register that felt almost like it was breathing. They walked in opposite directions, without looking back. Aderyn had 3 new encrypted files on her personal drive. A contact relay she would verify before dawn. A 14-month intelligence record she had not yet read, but already knew would be meticulous. Because Eunara Vey was meticulous in the way of someone who understood that precision was the only power she had and had never once wasted it. And a plan that was still more skeleton than architecture, but had, for the first time since she had stepped off the plane at Incheon, actual load-bearing bones. She walked back toward her apartment through the Seoul night, hands in her coat pockets, the city loud and indifferent around her. Her phone buzzed. The group-issued one, which she was carrying tonight for the first time in weeks, for reasons of deliberate performance. A message from Lucian Drieger, 10:47 p.m. "Productive day, I hope." She stopped under a streetlight. Read it twice. Consider the timestamp. He was working late, or he had someone watching her building, or both. She typed back, "Always." Then she kept walking. Behind her, at a distance, she had clocked and catalogued. A familiar set of footsteps kept pace with her own. Riven Kale, regular as a heartbeat, present as weather. She had a question she'd been sitting with about him since the elevator conversation. Since the apartment search she had ruled out his behavioral signature on. Since the growing structural suspicion that the man assigned to watch her was running his own parallel calculation about what he was watching and why. She wasn't ready to ask it yet. But she was getting close. The threat came on a Monday. Not from Seoul directly. He was too architecturally precise for that, too aware of the paper trail that direct threats left in the hands of someone who knew how to preserve them. It came through Lucian, delivered over their regular Thursday call 2 days early, which was itself the message before the message. Lucian called at 7 a.m. She was already at her desk. "Good morning," he said, in the tone of a man for whom mornings were a tactical resource rather than a time of day. "I wanted to touch base before the week gets away from us." "Of course," she said. "Mr. Kwon wanted me to convey his appreciation for your continued work. He's been impressed by the progress reports." A pause, timed with his usual surgical precision. "He also wanted me to mention, purely in the spirit of transparency, that he had occasion to review some background materials on your personal history this week." Aderyn's hand stilled on her keyboard. "1 beat, 2. "How thorough," she said. "He's a thorough man." Another pause. "He was particularly interested in your family, your mother specifically, Aderyn Voss, Still in Atlanta, I understand. Remarkable woman, 31 years as a high school science teacher. Your brother Marcus finishing his residency at Emory. A beat that lasted exactly long enough. It's a comfort, isn't it, knowing the people you love are settled, stable. The word stable landed in the conversation, like a key turning in a lock. Aderyn said nothing. Mr. Kwon simply wanted to acknowledge, Lucian continued, that he understands the importance of family, that he values continuity for everyone involved in the group's work. One final pause. I trust that's reassuring. Completely, she said. Her voice was level, warm, and entirely controlled. Thank you for the call, Lucian. I'll have the Phase 2 framework ready by Friday. She ended the call. She set the phone down. She sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, which was how long it took for the cold, clarifying fury to finish moving through her system and settle into something she could actually use. Then she opened her encrypted drive, pulled up the kill switch file, and began to build. She called Marcus from a burner phone she had purchased in week 3 and never used, walking 3 blocks from her apartment building at 6 a.m. the following day. He picked up on the second ring. Residency hours. He was always either sleeping or not sleeping at all, no in between. Ren, only Marcus called her that. Only Marcus had ever been able to make her name sound like something soft. Hey, she kept her voice easy, normal, the performance of a woman calling her brother on a regular morning because she missed him. How's the rotation? Brutal, beautiful, the usual. She could hear him smiling through the exhaustion. You okay? You never call this early. I know, she paused, let herself have one real moment of it, the actual thing underneath the performance. I wanted to hear your voice. Ren, his tone shifted. He knew her too well for the performance to fully land. He always had. What's going on? Nothing I can't handle, she said, which was true. Which she was going to make true in the next 72 hours if she had to burn the entire digital architecture of the Seoul group to the ground to do it. But I need you to do something for me without asking why. A pause. Okay. Take Mom somewhere for the next 2 weeks. A trip, a visit, whatever you want to call it. Somewhere you haven't been before. Use cash where you can. Don't post anything. Silence. She could hear him processing it. The specific silence of a man who was very smart and very measured, and was doing both of those things simultaneously on no sleep. That bad? He asked quietly. It's handled, she said. I just need to know you're both, she stopped. Please, Marcus. Done, he said. No argument. No further questions. Just the clean, immediate trust of someone who had spent a lifetime believing in her completely. We'll leave Thursday. Thank you. She let herself mean it all the way down. I'll explain everything when I'm home. You better, a beat. You're the smartest person I know, Ren. Whatever this is, you've got it. She stood on the Seoul pavement in the early morning light, her brother's voice in her ear, and felt something move in her chest that she did not have time for and could not afford and felt anyway. I know, she said. I love you. She ended the call, pocketed the burner, rolled her shoulders back. Rolled them back. And walked. The gala was scheduled for Saturday. The Seoul group's annual private function, not publicized, not documented in any accessible calendar, but referenced in enough internal communications that Aderyn had reconstructed its shape from the peripheral data around it. 200 guests, invitation only, the kind of event where the legitimate face of the group entertained its legitimate relationships, while the other architecture hummed quietly underneath. The entire building would be staffed at maximum capacity. Seoul himself would be present, visible, performing the role of distinguished industrialist with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for decades. The building's power infrastructure, she had learned in week 4, ran on a hybrid grid, municipal supply as primary, a private generator cluster in the basement as backup, the 2 systems managed by a switching controller she had mapped during a routine infrastructure audit, and noted, with the particular attention she gave to things she might need later, was accessible remotely through the building management system she now had complete administrative access to. She had not touched the switching controller. She had simply learned its shape, its timing, its failure modes, and its manual override sequence. On Saturday morning, 3 hours before the gala began, she sat in her apartment, opened her personal deck, and did 4 things in careful sequence. First, she isolated Marcus and her mother's location data from every platform she could access, social media, GPS, financial trail, and confirmed they had left Atlanta. They had. Second, she extracted the final layer of the blood block, the operational records she had been carefully, methodically pulling for 2 weeks in fragments small enough not to trigger the monitoring architecture, and completed the compilation. The file was now whole, encrypted, and distributed across 6 locations. 1 on her drive, 1 with Eunara's contact, 4 in offshore partitions she had established through relay chains that would take months to trace. Third, she activated the dead man's switch she had been building since week 3. Not deployed, not yet, but armed. A sequence of automated actions tied to a heartbeat monitor she wore as a fitness tracker on her left wrist, set to execute if her biometric signal went dark for more than 4 hours. The actions it would execute were specific, irreversible, and would make the Seoul Group's financial existence approximately as stable as tissue paper in a flood. Fourth, she opened the building management system, navigated to the power switching controller, and wrote a 3-line command sequence she had been composing in her head for 10 days. She did not execute it yet. She set it to execute at 9:47 p.m., the precise moment, extrapolated from the gala's internal schedule she had obtained through Eunara, when Kwon Seok would be standing at the center of his ballroom, 200 guests arranged around him, at the apex of the evening's most visible moment. Then she got dressed. Put on the one piece of clothing she had brought to Seoul that was not professional or practical or designed to disappear into an environment. A deep black suit that had cost her more than a month's rent 3 years ago and had been waiting in the back of her closet for exactly this kind of occasion, and went to the gala. She had not been invited. She went anyway, because she had spent 8 weeks building access to every system in this building, and a guest list was, at its foundation, just a database with a door attached. She arrived at 8:30 p.m., walked through the security checkpoint using credentials that the system recognized as valid because she had made them valid at 6 a.m. that morning, and entered the ballroom on the 56th floor, a space she had never seen operational, only in the building schematics, and which was, she had to acknowledge, genuinely extraordinary. Black and gold in the floor-to-ceiling Seoul skyline on all sides, the city enormous and glittering in the dark below. 200 people in evening wear, string quartet in the corner, wait staff moving through the room with the choreographed precision of a very expensive system running flawlessly. She took a glass of something from a passing tray and found a position near the east wall, back to the windows, full sightline across the room, and watched. Seok was at the center of it, precisely where she had expected him. Not performing exactly, he was too controlled for performance, but present in the way that a gravitational field is present, the room organized around him without anyone having been told to organize. He wore his authority the way he wore his suits, as if it had never occurred to him that it might not fit. He had not seen her yet. She watched him work the room, the measured attention he gave each guest, the economy of his smiles, the way he listened with the quality of a man who was always extracting data. And she thought about the blood block, about the dead man's ledger, about 11 years of records sitting in her encrypted drive, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the territory between them. At 9:43 p.m. he saw her. The room was between them, 40 feet of elegant noise and crystal and candlelight. He went still when he registered her, in the particular way of a man encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. His eyes moved from her face to the room around her, calculating, she suspected, how she had gotten in, who had authorized it, what it meant. She held his gaze and raised her glass slightly, a small, precise gesture. Hello. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He began to move toward her. At 9:47 p.m., every light in the building went out. Not a flicker, Not a gradual dimming. Total, immediate darkness. The clean termination of a system that had been running at full capacity and was now simply not. The ballroom went black except for the city light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul painting everything in the colors of its own perpetual luminescence. Blue and gold, and the deep arterial red of a city that didn't know how to stop. 200 people produce the sounds that 200 people produce when the lights go out. The sharp collective intake, the scattered voices, the particular register of alarm that hasn't yet decided how serious to be. And then the backup generators, which she had also addressed, did not come on. The switching controller command she had written at 9:47 p.m. was a two-stage sequence. Primary grid termination followed, 4 seconds later, by a generator isolation subroutine that locked the backup cluster out of the switching matrix for exactly 11 minutes. Long enough to make a point, short enough to avoid consequences she hadn't authorized. She had been specific about the 11 minutes. She was always specific. In the darkness, she moved. Not toward the exit, toward the window, because she wanted to see his face when the lights came back on. She found a position near the northeast corner, set down her glass, and waited. The room found its footing around her, phone flashlights appearing, staff moving to their emergency positions, the controlled chaos of a system responding to an unexpected input. She could hear Lucian's voice somewhere to her left, precise and authoritative, managing the room. She could hear the security frequency in her earpiece. She had tuned it before she arrived, cycling through rapid-fire position checks. She could not hear Seoul. 11 minutes and 4 seconds after the lights went out, they came back on. The room blinked back into existence, chandelier light flooding the ballroom, the string quartet lowering their phones, 200 faces rearranging themselves from alarm back toward composure with varying degrees of success. She found Seoul in under 2 seconds. He was 15 feet away. He had not moved to manage the room, had not moved toward an exit, had not done any of the things that disruption prompted in people who were not accustomed to it. He had stood exactly where he was when the lights went out, still and self-contained, the way of a man who trusted his environment completely, and was now conducting a very private, very rapid reassessment of that trust. He was looking directly at her. She met his eyes across the recovering room, in the returned light of a building that had just experienced, for the first time in its existence, a failure it could not explain and could not have prevented. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze with the calm, unhurried clarity of a woman who had just demonstrated, in the most unambiguous architectural language available to her, that the systems he believed he owned were no longer entirely his. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, quietly enough that it was only for her, "My office, tomorrow, 8 a.m. She picked up her glass from the windowsill. "I'll be there," she said. And she walked out of his ballroom, through the building she had just turned off and turned back on, into the elevator that carried her down 78 floors in measured silence, and out into the Seoul night that received her the way it always did. Indifferently, loudly. At full speed. She pulled out her personal phone and sent 2 messages. To Eunara, Phase 2, start the clock. To the number she had memorized, it's time. Then she put her phone away, turned her face into the night air, and walked home through a city that didn't know yet that everything was about to change. It would. She had written the code. She arrived at the 78th floor at 7:58 a.m. 2 minutes early. Deliberate. She wanted to be in the room before him, to own the space the way he always owned it, to be the fixed point that he walked toward rather than the variable that entered after. Small thing, architectural thing. The kind of detail that mattered in a confrontation between 2 people who both understood that power lived in the geometry of a room as much as in anything said inside it. The Polonia corridor was quiet. The iron-handled door was closed. She opened it and walked in. He was already there. Of course he was. Seated behind his desk for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, not standing at the window, not positioned in the neutral center of the room, but behind the desk, in the chair, in the full formal geometry of a man who had decided this morning, required a different architecture than their previous meetings. The mountain painting on the wall behind him. Seoul spread out beyond the glass on 3 sides, the city pale and enormous in the early morning light. Riven Kale stood to the left of the desk, not behind it, beside it, which was a specific positioning that told her the morning's structure before a word was spoken. Present not as furniture but as a loaded variable. His face gave nothing. It never did. Lucian Drieger was not in the room. She noted the absence and filed it. She crossed the office at her regular pace, sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited to, set her deck on the table in front of her, and looked at Kwon Seok-ryu across the geometry he had arranged. He looked back. "Last night," he said, "was a message." "It was a demonstration," she said. "Messages are ambiguous. Demonstrations are specific." Something moved in his jaw, controlled. "And what specifically were you demonstrating?" "That the infrastructure you believe is yours is currently running on architecture I designed, which means it runs the way I decide it runs." She kept her voice even, pleasant, the tone she used when the content of what she was saying was significant enough not to need additional emphasis. "The lights going out was the simple version. The version I haven't shown you yet is considerably more comprehensive." Seok-ryu was quiet for a moment. Outside, Seoul moved in its enormous morning rhythm. Indifferent, as always, to the conversations happening above it. "You've been inside systems you were not authorized to access," he said. "I was authorized to access everything. Those were the terms." She tilted her head slightly. "If there were systems you wanted to exclude, the time to specify that was before you handed me the keys." "There are boundaries," he said, "that exist beyond contract language." "There are," she agreed. "I found several of them. They're documented." A pause precisely timed. "Thoroughly." The word landed in the room the way she intended it to, not as a threat exactly, but as the clear structural outline of one, rendered in complete deniability. She had learned that from Lucian. She had learned a great deal from Lucian. Seok-ryu leaned back in his chair. It was the first time she had seen him make a movement that wasn't entirely deliberate. The small, involuntary adjustment of a man recalibrating against a situation that had exceeded his projected parameters. "What do you want?" he asked. Direct, no preamble. She had wondered when they would get here, when he would dispense with the architecture of implication and ask the actual question. She had expected it to take longer. "I want to finish the job I was hired to do," she said. "And I want to do it without anyone using my family as a conversational prop." His eyes moved, not much. "That was a demonstration," she said, returning his word to him precisely. "I understand. We've both made our points." She set her hands flat on the desk, open, unhurried, the body language of a woman who was not afraid of the room she was sitting in. "Now I'd like to have an actual conversation." A silence, long enough to be deliberate. "Leave us," Seok-ryu said. Riven didn't move immediately. She felt rather than saw it, the fraction of a second in which he ran his own calculation, his own assessment of the room and its variables. Then he moved toward the door, smooth and unhurried, and she heard it close behind her with the particular finality of very good craftsmanship. They were alone. "The blood block," Seok-ryu said, "flat, no inflection." "Yes." "You've extracted it." "Completely." He looked at her with the specific quality of a man who had spent decades in rooms where information was the only currency that mattered, assessing the weight of what she had just confirmed with the precision of someone pricing an asset whose value had just changed fundamentally. "And the dead man's switch," he said, "the fitness tracker." She kept her expression neutral. He had done his homework. She had expected he had, in fact, structured the switch so that discovering its existence was possible, because a threat that couldn't be found was a threat that couldn't be respected. "If my biometric signal goes dark for more than 4 hours," she said, "a sequence executes that is specific, comprehensive, and irreversible." She paused. Your net worth, distributed across 47 jurisdictions, becomes inaccessible in ways that would take between 3 and 5 years to partially unwind. The blood block in its entirety goes to 6 separate recipients, 3 of whom you'd recognize, 3 of whom you wouldn't, all of whom would know exactly what to do with it. Another pause. And the infrastructure I've built for you over the past 8 weeks, which is genuinely the best work I've ever done and which I am still, professionally, quite proud of, executes a full system wipe across every server cluster in the building. She said all of it in the same tone. She used to brief clients on project timelines. Ryu said nothing for a long time. The morning light moved across the desk between them, Seoul doing its slow daily rotation outside the glass. You built all of that, he said finally, while building my infrastructure. Concurrently, yes, the 2 architectures informed each other. She almost smiled. I'm efficient. He looked at her, and for the first time, in all the weeks she had spent in proximity to this man, she saw something in his expression that was not calculation, not intimidation, not the managed performance of authority. Something older than any of those things. Something that had not expected to be here and was, in its own deeply private way, reckoning with that. What do you actually want? He asked again, differently this time, the question stripped of its strategic housing. She had been thinking about her answer to this question for 3 days. Not the strategic answer, the true one. The one that had been forming since the night she sat in the basement tea house with Eunara and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what she was inside. I want the blood block to matter, she said. Not as a weapon, as a record. The people in that ledger, the outcomes documented in it, they deserve to be more than a compressed data node buried 4 layers deep in a system nobody was supposed to find. She held his gaze steadily. And I want the organization that produced it to be something different from what it's been. Not laundered, not rebranded, actually different, which means structural change, not cosmetic. He said nothing. You built something real, she said. Underneath all of it, the logistics, the infrastructure, the legitimate architecture, there's a genuinely sophisticated operation that could function, profitably and sustainably, without the other half of it. I've been inside your systems for 8 weeks. I know what's there. A pause. You don't need the blood blocks architecture anymore. You built it when you had to. You kept it because dismantling it required trusting someone with the knowledge of its existence. She let that sit. Here I am. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Ryu sat very still behind his desk, in the chair he had chosen this morning as his architecture of authority, in the office he had built at the top of a building he had constructed over a city he had spent 30 years making his. And he looked at the woman across from him, who had walked into his infrastructure with a laptop bag and a custom-built deck, and had taken it apart from the inside with the calm, methodical precision of someone who had never once doubted she could. She watched him think. She was good at watching people think. She could read the architecture of it, the sequence of considerations, the weight distribution, the moment when a calculation completes and a decision begins to form. She knew when he arrived at it. He stood, moved around the desk, not toward her exactly, but to the window, the place she had always seen him when he was doing his most private thinking, and stood looking out at Seoul with his hands behind his back. She waited. The blood block, he said to the window. The recipients you named. If I agree to what you're proposing, structural change, your terms, what happens to it? It stays encrypted, in my custody, accessible to me and no one else. She paused. As long as the terms hold. And if they don't? Then you already know the answer to that. A long silence. Seoul moved below them. The 3 recipients I wouldn't recognize, he said. Who are they? She had wondered if he would ask. She had decided 3 days ago that if he did, she would tell him the truth, because the truth was more useful to her here than the ambiguity. One is Eunara Vay's contact, she said. One is a data security organization I have a long-standing relationship with. One is a journalist I have never met but whose work I've followed for 6 years, and who I trust to use it correctly if it ever becomes necessary. A pause. It won't become necessary. That's the point. He was quiet for a moment. Eunara. Yes. She's been working against us. She's been working towards something different, Aderyn said carefully. Which is, I'd argue, what you're also now being offered. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the office, across the desk and the morning light and the 8 weeks and everything they contained, with the expression of a man who had just finished a very long calculation and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to be. The infrastructure you've built, he said, it runs on your architecture. Yes. If you leave. I've documented everything, she said. Fully, transparently, it will run without me. She met his eyes. But I'm proposing I don't leave, not entirely. She opened her deck, pulled up a document she had written at 4 a.m. that morning and turned it to face him. I've drafted a consultancy agreement, retained advisor, renewable annually, specific scope. I continue to maintain and evolve the infrastructure. You continue to run a legitimate organization. She paused. And we both pretend the past 8 weeks were exactly what you hired me for. He crossed to the desk, looked at the document. Read it, actually read it. With the focused attention of a man who understood that language was architecture and details were load-bearing. He read for a long time. Then he looked up. There's a clause here, he said. Section 4, subclause C. The kill switch clause, she said. It's in every contract I sign. It's non-negotiable. He looked at it again. The clause that gave her the right to pull her work, her access, and her cooperation entirely if the terms of the agreement were violated. And that specified, in precise legal language, exactly what happened to the encrypted files in that event. He set the document down. He was quiet for a moment that contained something she hadn't expected to find in this room. Not defeat, not capitulation, but the specific gravity of a man standing at a genuine inflection point and understanding, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, that the path forward required something other than force. Riven, he said. The door opened. She hadn't heard him knock. Riven entered, moved to his position, and looked at Siak Ryu with the particular quality of attention of a man who had served this person for long enough to read the room before the instruction came. Siak Ryu looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them, old and private, and not for her to decode. Then Siak Ryu looked back at Aderyn. Send Lucian Drieger to HR, he said. Not to her, to Riven. Effective immediately, full separation package, have legal draft the documents this afternoon. Riven's expression didn't change. Yes, sir. And have the boardroom prepared for 11 a.m., he looked at Aderyn. We'll need to discuss the transition structure for the new organizational framework. A pause, the thinnest edge of something that was not quite a smile. I assume you have thoughts. I have a 47-page framework document, she said. I'll have it on your desk by 10. He nodded once, the economy of a man who had spent a lifetime not wasting movements. Ms. Voss, he extended his hand across the desk. She stood, looked at the hand, looked at him. She shook it. His grip was exactly what she had expected. Firm, brief, the handshake of a man who treated agreements as architecture and understood that what had just been built between them was load-bearing. She picked up her deck, walked to the door. Ms. Voss. She turned. He was looking at the mountain painting on the wall behind his desk. The single scroll, traditional ink, the mountain in rain. He looked at it the way you look at something you've owned long enough to stop seeing it and have suddenly, for some reason, seen again. The infrastructure you built, he said quietly. The legitimate half. Yes. A pause. It's the best system this organization has ever had. She looked at him for a moment, at the painting, at Seoul beyond the glass, enormous and indifferent and continuing. I know, she said. And she walked out. In the Polonia corridor, Riven fell into step beside her, not behind, not following. Beside. A different geometry than every morning for the past 4 weeks. They walked the length of the corridor in silence. At the elevator, she pressed the call button and they waited. Lucian, she said. I know, he said. Did you know what he was reporting? A pause. I knew he was reporting. She thought about that. About the elevator conversation weeks ago, about counter-questions in descending light, about behavioral signatures and apartment searches, and the specific, particular steadiness of a man who had been running his own parallel calculation this entire time. "What happens to you," she said, "in the new structure?" He looked at the elevator doors. "That's not decided yet." "No," she said, "but you've thought about it." The elevator arrived. The doors opened. They both looked at the interior, the muted light, the mirrored walls, the small contained space that had held, over the past 4 weeks, more honest conversation than any room in this building. "I think," he said carefully, "that there may be a version of this organization that requires a different kind of enforcement than it has historically employed." He paused. "And I think whoever fills that role would need to understand both what the organization has been and what it's trying to become." She stepped into the elevator, turned to face him. "That's a very diplomatic answer," she said. "I'm working on it," he said, the closest thing to dry humor she had ever heard from him. It suited him. She looked at him for a moment, at the stillness and the calculation and the thing underneath both of them that she had been circling for weeks without nomming. "Floor 44, she said. "I have a 47-page document to finish." He nodded. The doors began to close. "Riven." He looked at her through the narrowing gap. "The apartment search, week 3, the person who reset my tells." She held his gaze. "Was that you?" The doors closed. She rode down alone, looking at her own reflection in the mirrored wall, the techwear coat, the custom deck under her arm, the expression of a woman who had just walked out of the most significant negotiation of her career and was already running the next sequence. The elevator reached 44. The doors opened onto her glass-walled office, the Seoul skyline, the workstation she had rebuilt from the ground up into something that was now genuinely, architecturally extraordinary. She sat down. She opened her deck. She began to write. 3 months later, it rained in Seoul. Not the tentative, apologetic rain of early spring, but the real thing, the kind that came in off the yellow sea with the full weight of the season behind it, turning the city's surfaces into mirrors and filling the air with the particular smell of a megalopolis being washed clean, whether it wanted to be or not. Aderyn stood on the helipad of the Seoul Tower, 78 floors above the city, and let it rain on her. She had been up here for 11 minutes. She knew because she had checked her watch when she stepped out, the fitness tracker on her left wrist, still armed, still running, the dead man's switch still present inside it like a quiet structural fact. She had considered deactivating it in the weeks since the boardroom, had decided against it. Not because she needed it anymore, exactly, but because the architecture of power she had built in this place rested on a foundation of verified trust, and verified trust was not the same as naive trust, and she was not, and had never been, naive. The city below was enormous and rain-blurred and entirely itself, the grids and lights and organized chaos of 11 million people living at full volume, indifferent to the 78th floor as they had always been, as they would continue to be. She had come to find that indifference clarifying rather than humbling. The city didn't care what had happened in these towers. It simply continued. That was what cities did. What you built inside them was your own business. She looked out at it for a long time. Then she went back inside. The boardroom was on the 62nd floor. She had redesigned it in the first month. Not the aesthetics, those were fine. The long obsidian table and the floor-to-ceiling glass were already doing what they needed to do, but the infrastructure. Every display surface, every communication channel, every data feed running into this room now ran through her architecture, which meant it ran clean, which meant when numbers appeared on these screens they were real numbers, and when communications were logged, they were logged completely. And when decisions were made in this room, they were made with accurate information, rather than the carefully curated version of reality that had been the boardroom's primary operating environment for the better part of a decade. She had told Seoul, when she presented the boardroom redesign, that it was the most important thing she had built in the building. He had looked at it for a long time before he responded. "Because of what it can do," he asked. Because of what it can't do anymore, she said. He had not argued. The 11 a.m. meeting had been running for 30 minutes when she arrived, which was intentional. She had learned in the first restructuring session that arriving to an already running room gave her data that arriving at its beginning did not, the temperature of the conversations already in progress, the alliances visible in the seating geometry, the small behavioral signals of people who had not yet fully adjusted to the new architecture and were still, in unguarded moments, operating from the old one. She walked in without announcement, set her deck at the head of the table, the high-backed chair that had been the seat of a particular kind of authority for 30 years and was now the seat of a different kind, and pulled up the morning's agenda on the room's central display. 7 people at the table. She knew all of them. The restructured leadership of the Seoul Group's legitimate operational divisions, assembled over the past 3 months with a combination of internal promotion and careful external recruitment. People who had been selected not for loyalty to a historical power structure, but for the specific quality of competence that the new architecture required. Eunara sat 3 seats to her left, in the role of Chief Financial Oversight Officer, a position that had not existed in the old structure, because the old structure had not wanted its finances overseen, only managed. Eunara had taken it with the particular quiet intensity of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this work and was not going to waste a second of the opportunity. She caught Aderyn's eye when she entered, gave the small, precise nod that had become their private shorthand for on track, and returned to the briefing document in front of her. Riven sat at the far end of the table. She had proposed his inclusion in the restructured leadership in the 4th week, in a meeting with Seoul that had been shorter than she expected. She had outlined the role, head of security architecture, a position that redefined enforcement as protection, that rebuilt the group's physical security infrastructure on the same principles she had used to rebuild its digital one. Transparent, documented, accountable. Seoul had listened to the full proposal before he responded. "He'll say no," he said. "Ask him," she said. He had. Riven had said yes. She had not been surprised. She had read the counter-questions in the elevator, the behavioral signature that didn't match the institutional role, the man running his own parallel calculation about what he was inside and whether it was what he wanted to remain. He looked up when she entered the boardroom. The way he always did, the clearing the room reflex was still there, probably always would be. It was structural, built in at a level deeper than any organizational change could reach. But the geometry of it had shifted. He wasn't checking for threats. He was checking for her. Different calculation, same precision. She gave him nothing and everything simultaneously, which was a skill she had been developing for 31 years and had recently begun to feel she was getting genuinely good at. Kwon Seok-ryu was not at the table. He had not been at the table for 6 weeks, which was the arrangement they had reached in the 3rd month of the restructuring, not his absence from the organization, but his removal from the operational seat, the daily machinery of decision-making that he had occupied for 3 decades, and which the new architecture required to be occupied differently. He sat, instead, in an advisory capacity, a role she had designed carefully, with the particular precision she brought to structures she needed to be both functional and symbolically coherent, present enough to be respected, bounded enough to be honest. He had accepted it with more grace than she had projected, which was a data point she had added to her ongoing model of him and which had revised several of her earlier assessments upward. He was not gone. He was not diminished, exactly. He was repositioned, the way you reposition a component that is genuinely powerful but has been operating in the wrong part of the system, moved to where its particular qualities could function without compromising everything around them. She had explained it to him, using exactly that analogy. He had looked at her for a long time. "You're telling me I was a legacy system," he said. "I'm telling you," she said, "that you were running in an environment that was wrong for what you actually are, which is different." He had thought about that for a while. "And what," he asked, "do you think I actually am?" She considered the question honestly. The mountain painting, the iron-handled door, the city watched from the window, the 30 years of building something that was simultaneously extraordinary and destructive, the handshake across the desk, the way he had read every word of a contract before he agreed to it. Someone who built something real, she said, and who is capable of being responsible for what it becomes. He had not responded immediately, but the next morning he had sent her a message, through the official channel, documented, logged, that contained 4 words. "I'll hold you to that." She had filed it in the kill switch folder, where she kept things that mattered. The meeting ran for 90 minutes. When it was done, the room cleared with the particular efficiency of people who had actual work to return to, which was itself a new development, the boardroom having historically been a place where time was performed rather than spent. She stayed at the head of the table while the others filed out, reviewing the session notes her deck had compiled automatically, flagging 3 action items that required follow-up and 1 decision that needed to be revisited before implementation. Eunara paused at the door. "The relay contact confirmed this morning," she said quietly. "The case file is complete. They have what they need." Aderyn looked up from her deck. This was the other structure running in parallel, the one that existed outside the Seoul building entirely, the one that Eunara had been building for 3 years, and that Aderyn had completed in the final weeks before the boardroom meeting. The blood block, fully extracted, fully documented, delivered through channels that had nothing to do with the new organizational framework and everything to do with the 11 years of record it contained. The people in that ledger, the outcomes documented in it. "Good," she said. "There will be proceedings," Eunara said. "Eventually, it'll be complex." "It should be complex," Aderyn said. "It was complex." She paused. "We've done what we can do from inside. The rest belongs to people with different tools." Eunara nodded. The tired, fierce expression, the one Aderyn had first seen in the basement tea house in Insadong, in the warm underground light over cold omega tea, was still there. Probably always would be. But there was something alongside it now that hadn't been there before. Not peace exactly. Something more structural than peace. Purpose, maybe. The specific quality of a person who has found the work that was always meant to be theirs, and is finally doing it in full daylight. "Tea tonight?" Eunara asked. "Same place," Aderyn said. "Always." She left, the door closed. Aderyn sat alone at the head of the obsidian table, in the high-backed chair, in the boardroom that now ran clean, looking out at the Seoul morning through 62 floors of glass. Her phone buzzed, personal line. Marcus, a photograph, no message, just the image. Her mother at a table somewhere warm and unfamiliar, laughing at something out of frame, a drink in her hand, the particular expression of a woman who is deeply, genuinely fine. Aderyn looked at it for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the table, pressed her palms flat against the obsidian surface, cool and smooth, and exactly as solid as it looked, and took a breath. She thought about Silicon Valley, about the apartment she had sublet for 6 months that had now been sublet for 8, and that she was no longer certain she intended to return to. About the wait list of clients she had not checked in 4 months and was only now beginning to think about how to handle. About San Francisco fog and startup energy, and the specific, kinetic satisfaction of a career that had been entirely on her terms. She thought about Seoul, about rain on a helipad and the smell of a city being washed clean, about a basement tea house and an iron-handled door and an elevator descending through muted light, and a mountain painted in ink on a dark wall, and the precise, specific, irreversible way that 8 weeks inside a broken system had changed the shape of everything that came after. She thought about the 47-page framework document, now 3 months implemented, the clean architecture running in every system of this building, the numbers on these screens that were real numbers, the decisions made in this room that were made with accurate information. She thought about what it meant to rebuild something. Not rebranded, not laundered, actually rebuilt from the foundation up, with the old structure's best materials and none of its rot, into something that could bear the weight of being looked at directly. She had done that. She was still doing it. And she was, She realized sitting at the head of the table in the room she had rebuilt in the building she had rewired in the city she had come to 6 months ago, with a laptop bag and a custom-built deck, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had never encountered a system she couldn't crack. She was not done. There was more to build. There was always more to build. That was the thing about architecture. You finished one structure and the next one was already waiting, already presenting itself in the shape of a problem that wanted solving, a system that wanted upgrading, a broken thing that wanted the specific and irreplaceable attention of someone who knew how to look at it without flinching. She opened her deck. She opened a new document. At the top, she typed 2 words, not a title, not a project name, just the thing she wrote at the beginning of every new thing she built, the private notation that meant this is where it starts. This is the foundation. Everything that comes after rests on this. Phase 1. She began to type. Outside, Seoul continued in its enormous, indifferent way, 11 million people, and the organized chaos of their living, the grids and lights and rain-washed streets, the city that had received her 7 months ago without ceremony, and had not, since then, offered her any. It didn't need to. She was not here for the city's acknowledgement. She was here because the work was here, and the work was hers, and she was finally, completely, in the way that only becomes possible when you have walked into the hardest room you have ever entered and walked back out on your own terms. Exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't conquer the city. She upgraded it. And it would never run the same way again.